Hello. Tonight I'm going to be refuting the claim that marijuana will become legalized in California in November 2010. The advocate's secondary claims are that 1, marijuana will create a generous amount of revenue for the state and reduce the amount of money spent on enforcing bans on marijuana. 2, there is a sufficient demand for marijuana, and 3, the legalization of marijuana has received an abundant amount of support. In the advocate's first claim, he states that marijuana will increase revenue and reduce the amount of money spent on enforcing bans on marijuana, yet fails to recognize that the greatest costs of marijuana are not related to its prohibition. Rather, they are the costs resulting from marijuana use itself, the costs in terms of abuse and addiction. And that abuse costs us all. The National Center on Addiction and Substance Abuse, or CASA, at Columbia University estimated last year that substance abuse and addiction cost federal, state, and local governments $467 billion in 2005, and that it would rank near the top with defense, Social Security, and Medicare. The advocate supports his claim by stating that the state would save over $200 million in law enforcement costs for things such as arrests, prosecutions, trials, and imprisonment. This is actually a false analogy. Supporters of legalization like to say that decriminalizing marijuana would free up law enforcement resources and provide a tax base to fund prevention and treatment, when in fact CASA estimates just 13% of the combined state and federal substance abuse costs are attributable to the justice system. Now let's take a look at the advocate's second claim. He states that there is a sufficient demand for marijuana and backs up his claim with a survey from the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. This survey illustrated that 1.9 million Californians admitted to using marijuana in the past month. This is an irrelevant thesis and a false cause as well. This actually would contradict the advocate's main claim. Yes, the advocate gave sufficient statistics, yet he did not acknowledge the reason why the survey was presented. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services surveyed these citizens to report how frequent marijuana is being consumed and that the so-called demand is brought by a means of addiction. The U.S. Department of Health and Human Services stated that marijuana can become addicting as the body becomes dependent on it. The brain adapts to the stimulation of its pleasure centers and can rewire itself after repeated reinforcement. Therefore, we will have an abundant use of marijuana that will eventually affect the health of the user, and as the health of the user deteriorates, there will be more costs associated to treatment. The advocate's last claim states that legalization of marijuana has received an abundant amount of support and backs up his claim by a petition and a survey that showed a significant amount of voters to be in favor of legalization of marijuana. The petition he illustrated was only a petition for legalizing marijuana to be on the ballot. Then again, it would possibly not go through because according to the Public Policy Institute of California, 38% are conservative, 32% are liberal, and 30% are moderate. With that said, having most of the population being conservative, they will not be in favor of legalizing marijuana when the actual voting takes place, where they perceive moral education to be ideal in any process involving such actions, according to a major conservative politician, William Bennett. In conclusion, the advocate assumed his main claim to be a given that marijuana will be legalized in November, which has not yet been proven, and had a violation of the test of reasoning in his first claim that marijuana will increase revenue and reduce the amount of money spent on enforcing bans on marijuana, and gave hasty and sweeping generalizations on his second and third claim that there is a sufficient demand for marijuana and that it has received an abundant amount of support. Thank you.
All right, the signposting is all good. On the first point, when you talk about the other costs of consumption, I think those are pretty solid costs, except that they're not specified to marijuana consumption. And then the follow-up evidence that you have says that just 13% of the costs are due to law enforcement or judicial activity, justice activity, and I think that that does limit some of the cost savings potentially. Again, it's not as particular to marijuana use as you might like, but I think it's a good general response to have, and if you had anything that was particular with marijuana, that would be a good place to put it as an example on that point. Your signpost on the second point was easy to follow. You kind of get into a discussion about how the advocate's point is an irrelevant thesis, and then you actually use that to bring in a thesis that deals with addiction and how the data the advocate uses actually demonstrates that there is a substantial amount of addiction and that would create a problem. I think that's a little bit of a stretch to try and get it in, but once you've got it there, you need to follow up a little bit more with some of the impact of what that addiction would constitute. Maybe those would explain some of the costs on that first point. Gateway drug use is a possibility there as well, so there might be some other things that you could put into that argument since you went to all the effort to kind of sneak in that link to these other issues. On the final point, your label was pretty clear. I think that you're making some assumptions about what the political spectrum means and that they'll actually show up. The advocate's evidence is more specific, I think, to the public opinion survey on this particular issue, but I think one of the things that you could mention is that there hasn't been any campaign on it yet. The discussion of whether or not there are negative costs, which if you were correct on the first point would certainly discourage people from seeing that last point as being desirable. That's okay. And I thought that your presses on the generalizations that were being made were okay, but they needed to be a little bit stronger. All right. Thank you.